I have always believed that love is the most vivid color in the universe. Not the kind you mix on a palette or squeeze from a tube, but the kind that bleeds into everything you do, every decision you make, every breath you take at 3 in the morning when the world is quiet and your heart is speaking in the only language it truly knows. My name is Colin Rogers and I paint. I paint because when words fail me, which is often because I am the kind of person who feels too much and says too little, the brush speaks for me. It translates the chaos inside my chest into something people can stand in front of and understand. Or at least, that is what I always told myself. I was 24 when my life began to unravel in the most spectacular and devastating way imaginable. Let me paint you a picture. I grew up in a warm, sunlit house in Manchester with my parents, Richard and Elena Rogers, two of the most quietly extraordinary people I have ever had the privilege of knowing. My father is an architect, a man who builds things meant to last, who believes deeply in foundations and structure. My mother is a botanist who talks to her plants like they are old friends and cries at sunsets because she says beauty should be acknowledged out loud. Between the two of them, I inherited a love for creating things, for noticing beauty where others would walk straight past it, and for a kind of tenderness that people often mistook for naivety. I was not naive. I was just hopeful. There is a difference. I was also, by any reasonable standard, a young man who had been blessed in more ways than one. I knew this not from arrogance but from observation. I had dark auburn hair that curled slightly at the ends when it was humid, green eyes that people compared to stained glass when the afternoon light hit them, and a jaw that my mother said could cut marble. I was lean but not slight, with artist's hands, long-fingered, always slightly stained with paint no matter how many times I washed them, permanently carrying the ghost of whatever I was currently creating. I was brilliant in school. I had graduated top of my art program and had received no fewer than 4 commendations before I was 22. My professors called me exceptional. My fellow students called me focused. My parents called me their heart. And Marco Vitelli called me his. Or so I thought. Marco was 36 years older than me, and he walked into a gallery opening I had attended with the kind of confidence that made the room tilt slightly in his direction. He was Italian-British, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes and dark hair and a way of looking at you that made you feel like the only person in the world. He was the co-director of Vitelli & Caro, a mid-sized investment firm that dealt in real estate, art acquisition and private equity. He wore suits that cost more than my monthly rent. He drove a car that made strangers turn their heads in the street. And he chose me. Or so I thought. He courted me the way people court things they want to keep, with an intensity that felt like devotion. Roses sent to my studio. Dinner reservations at places I had to look up online just to understand the dress code. Long evenings on his apartment balcony, his arm around my shoulders, his voice low and warm in my ear as the city spread out below us like a painting I had not yet managed to replicate. He proposed 8 months into our relationship on a Thursday evening in October, with a ring that caught the candlelight and a speech that made my eyes sting. "You're the most extraordinary person I've ever met," he said, his dark eyes steady on mine. "Everything you create, everything you are, I want all of it. I want you, Colin. I want forever with you." I said yes. Of course I said yes. And I began painting him a piece every 3 months as a token of love. A private ritual just between us. I would lose myself in the work for weeks, layering colors, rebuilding the canvas over and over until I had captured something true, something that felt like what I felt when I looked at him. I would present it to him over dinner, watch his face change when he saw it, and feel a warmth in my chest so complete it was almost unbearable. I was so in love I could not see the bars of the cage he was quietly, methodically building around me. It was a Tuesday in late February when I heard it. I had come back early from the supply store. They had run out of a particular cadmium yellow I needed and I had not wanted to substitute, and I let myself into Marco's apartment with the spare key he had given me 3 months after we began dating. The apartment was large and open plan, all glass and dark marble and low lighting, and Marco had not heard me come in. He was in the study, the door slightly ajar, speaking on the phone. I was going to announce myself. I was reaching for the study door handle when I heard my name. "Colin doesn't know anything, Gio. He's sweet and he's trusting and he paints because it makes him feel something. He's not paying attention to what's happening around him." I stopped. My hand dropped to my side. "I know the company needs capital. I know the audit is coming." Marco's voice was low and controlled, the voice he used in boardrooms, not the voice he used with me. "But I have a plan. Colin will be far more productive after the wedding. We can keep him comfortable. A little medicated, you understand? Just enough to keep him manageable. He'll paint, I'll sell, and by the time the audit is behind us and the Fontaine deal is closed, we'll have more than enough to restructure. Silence. He was listening to his brother on the other end of the line. After that. Another pause. We part ways. I'll cite incompatibility. He can go back to painting in whatever studio he can afford without my backing. By then it won't matter. I stood in the hallway of Marco Vitelli's apartment, the man I had agreed to marry, the man who had a ring on my finger, the man for whom I had poured my entire heart onto canvas, over and over again, and I felt the floor disappear from beneath my feet. Not literally. But the sensation was near enough to make my vision blur. He was going to drug me. He was going to lock me up after our wedding. He was going to use my art, my passion, my most private language, the thing I had offered him as an act of love, as a tool to save his failing company. And then, when he no longer needed me, he was going to throw me away like a discarded sketch. I backed out of the apartment without making a sound. I do not remember walking to the underground station. I do not remember the journey home. I remember sitting on the floor of my studio, surrounded by paint-stained rags and half-finished canvases, and pressing my forehead to my knees and breathing, in, out, until the devastation became something I could hold instead of something that held me. The grief came first. That raw, animal grief of realizing someone you loved never existed the way you believed them to. That the warmth you felt, the safety, the belonging, it was all architecture. Built to keep you in, not to keep you whole. And then, slowly, quietly, like the first thin line of light before a dawn nobody asked for, came something else. Anger. Clean and cold and absolute. Before we dive into this twisted, reborn, revenge and redemption, emotional love story, if you are obsessed with reborn and revenge stories, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and also comment on the story, and don't forget this story is an original work of MeBL Stories, no copyrights. If you see this story in another channel, please report that channel for copyright and theft. Now let's dive in. I had given that man pieces of my soul, wrapped in paint and canvas and presented across candlelit dinner tables. I had trusted him with the most honest parts of me. And he had taken them and sold them. Wait, sold them. I sat up. It took me 4 days of careful, methodical searching to confirm what I had begun to suspect in the hours after I heard Marco's phone call. I had been giving him paintings as tokens of love. I had never asked what he did with them after I presented them. I assumed, because I was hopelessly trusting and believed in the story we had built together, that they hung in his home or in storage, cherished for their meaning rather than their monetary value. I was wrong. Through a contact I had in the art community, a former classmate named Dara who worked at a prestigious auction house in London, I discovered that 6 of the pieces I had painted for Marco had been sold at private auction over the past 2 years. Each one listed under a single artist name. Marco Vitelli. My pieces. My labor, my sleepless nights, my heart spread across canvas, all of it attributed to a man who had never held a brush in his life with any meaningful intention. He had sold them, collected the profits, and been quietly building a reputation for himself in art acquisition circles as a man of significant creative taste. He had even, I discovered, been interviewed in a small but respected arts magazine 3 months prior, discussing his artistic practice, and hinting at plans for a future gallery. A gallery built on the back of my stolen work. I sat with this information for a long time. Then I made a phone call to Dara. "Tell me," I said carefully, "about Rafael Moreno." Dara went quiet for a moment. Then, "Why are you asking about Rafael Moreno?" "Because I want to know everything." Rafael Moreno was a Spanish artist in his mid-50s, internationally renowned, whose work commanded prices in the high 6 figures. He was celebrated for the ferocity of his compositions, large, explosive pieces that seemed to move even when they were still, full of color and tension and an almost physical intensity. He was also, famously, an artist who pursued art theft with the fervor of a holy crusade. He had taken 2 collectors to court in the past decade. He had won both cases with devastating finality. He was, as Dara described him, the kind of man who keeps intellectual property lawyers on speed dial and considers it a reasonable lifestyle choice. "Why?" Dara asked again, more carefully this time. "Because," I said, "I need to replicate one of his works. Accurately. Precisely. And I need it to look like something Marco Vitelli would believe was an original Colin Rogers." The silence stretched. "Colin," Dara said slowly, "what exactly is happening?" I told her. Everything. The phone call, the paintings, the auction records, the planned drugging, the wedding, the disposal. I told her all of it, and my voice only shook once, near the beginning, and then steadied itself like a ship finding its heading after a storm. When I finished, Dara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me which piece you want to replicate." I chose a piece called Sangre y Luz, Blood and Light. It was one of Moreno's most recognizable works, a vast and violent composition in deep reds, burning golds, and a sliver of impossible pale blue running through its center like a wound beginning to close. The original hung in a private collection in Madrid. High-quality prints existed in art books and online references, enough for me, with my skill, my trained eye, my years of technical practice, to produce a version so precise it would be indistinguishable from the original to any untrained observer. And Marco, for all his money and his curated persona, was deeply, foundationally untrained. I worked for 3 weeks. I painted in the early hours when my mind was sharpest and the city outside my studio window was dark and still. I did not sleep much. I ate only when my hands shook enough to affect my brushwork. I poured everything I had into it, not love this time, not devotion, but something colder and more deliberate. A precision that was its own kind of art. Every stroke calculated. Every layer true to the original. Every choice made with the focused, meticulous intention of someone who has decided, finally, to stop being gentle. While I painted, I also planned. I booked flights. 3 of them, one for me, one for my mother, one for my father. Paris. One way, departing in 23 days. I sat down with my parents and explained everything, watching their faces move through disbelief, then grief for my sake, then the particular, quiet fury that parents carry when someone has hurt their child. My father did not say much. He pressed his mouth into a line and squeezed my shoulder once, firm and steady. My mother wept silently, then dried her eyes and said, "Tell us what you need us to do." "Pack," I said. "But do it slowly and tell no one." My father nodded. My mother nodded. We did not speak of it again. I also, during these weeks, quietly contacted a lawyer, a specialist in art law whom Dara had recommended, and provided her with documentation of every piece I had sold, every auction record under Marco's name, every piece of evidence I had accumulated that my work had been stolen and misattributed. "This is significant," the lawyer said, reviewing the file I had assembled. "I know," I said. "If the party in question were to present any of these as his own work publicly, especially if a known artist were to recognize their style being referenced." "He will," I said. "Very soon. And the artist in question will know about it before the day is out." She looked at me over her reading glasses for a long moment. "You're thorough," she said. "I paint," I told her. "Thoroughness is part of the craft." On a Friday evening, I dressed carefully, dark trousers, a deep green shirt that Marco had once said made my eyes look like sea glass, and I arrived at his apartment with the painting wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with a simple ribbon. The way I always delivered them. The ritual unchanged. Marco opened the door and smiled his wide, confident smile, and something in my chest turned over quietly. Not grief exactly. Not love. Something in between, the ghost of a feeling for a person who had never fully existed. "Colin." He stepped back to let me in, his hand warm at the small of my back as I entered. "I was beginning to think you weren't coming tonight." "I wouldn't miss it," I said, and I kept my face entirely, carefully open. Soft. The way he expected me to be. We had dinner. He poured wine. He talked about a property deal he was managing, a client he was entertaining next week, the expansion plans that never quite came to fruition. I listened and responded and asked questions in the right places, and I thought, with a strange and distant clarity, this is the last meal. After dessert, I set the wrapped canvas on the table between us. "For you," I said. 3 months. Right on schedule. He unwrapped it slowly, deliberately, with the care of a man who had learned to perform appreciation. And then the paper fell away and he saw it, and his breath caught. It was magnificent. I knew it. I had made it magnificent on purpose. "Colin," he breathed. His dark eyes were moving over it with an expression I recognized. Not love, I understood now, but calculation. Valuation. The look of a man who was already pricing something. This is extraordinary. Even by your standards." "I know," I said. "I think it's the best I've ever done." He looked up at me and his smile was slow and warm and completely hollow, and I smiled back and felt nothing at all. "This one," he said softly, "is going to change everything." "Yes," I agreed. "I think it will." I left an hour later, kissed him at the door with a mouth that did not tremble, and walked to my car and sat in it for 2 full minutes with my hands in my lap before I drove away. The next morning, my family and I boarded a plane to Paris. Before I switched my phone to airplane mode, I sent Marco a text message. "I've been doing a lot of thinking. I'm not the person you believe me to be, and I don't think you are either. Please don't contact me. This is goodbye. See." I turned off my phone. I closed my eyes. And somewhere over the English Channel, I exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. I watched it from Paris on my phone from a small apartment in the 11th arrondissement that smelled like old wood and fresh bread from the boulangerie downstairs. I had sent Rafael Moreno's team a message before I left. An anonymous tip with a photograph of the painting, the auction records I had compiled, and the name Marco Vitelli. I had sent the same documentation to 2 art journalists. I had sent the evidence of the previously stolen pieces to my lawyer, who filed the appropriate complaints with the appropriate bodies. It took less than 48 hours. Marco, it emerged, had presented Sangre y Luz, my replica, his claimed masterpiece, at a private collector's dinner on the Saturday evening 24 hours after I had placed it in his hands. He had stood in front of it and spoken about his artistic process to a room full of wealthy investors, 3 of whom were personally acquainted with Rafael Moreno's work. One of them recognized it within minutes. By Sunday morning, Rafael Moreno's legal team had been contacted. By Sunday afternoon, they had arrived at Marco's apartment with the kind of documentation that makes walls feel very close together. By Sunday evening, the story had broken in 3 arts publications simultaneously, each one running with the evidence I had provided: the auction history, the misattributed paintings, the theft of my work, the fraudulent sale of Sangre y Luz as an original. By Monday morning, Marco Vitelli had been arrested. I sat cross-legged on my new apartment floor with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, and I read every article. I watched the clip from a news broadcast where Marco, disheveled, jaw tight, nothing at all like the man who had smiled at me over candlelit dinners, was escorted from his building. I watched his company's stock of credibility collapse in real time. I watched the collectors he had defrauded begin to come forward. I watched the gallery plans he had hinted at become the subject of contemptuous commentary in every corner of the art world he had tried to infiltrate. Vitelli and Caro froze their assets within the week. His brother Gio, it emerged, had known about the stolen paintings and had been complicit in at least 2 of the private auctions. The audit Marco had been trying to survive arrived anyway with reinforcements. The company crumbled. And I sat in Paris and I drank my cold coffee and I felt, not triumphant exactly. Not gleeful. Something quieter than that. Something that felt, surprisingly, like the first morning after a very long illness. Fragile. Real. Clean. My mother knocked softly on my apartment door and came in with a fresh cup of coffee and sat beside me on the floor without being asked, the way she had done when I was 8 years old and had scraped my knee badly enough to cry. "It's over?" she asked. "It's over," I said. She put her arm around me and we sat together in the thin Parisian morning light, and I leaned my head against her shoulder and let myself feel it all. The grief, the anger, the relief, the strange, hollow victory of a revenge that had cost me more than I had expected. And I let it move through me the way light moves through a window, changing nothing and everything all at once. I had not planned to fall in love again. I had, in fact, made a rather firm private arrangement with myself that love was a country I would visit only in my art from this point forward and never again in actual life. Paris, however, did not consult my arrangements before arranging things of its own. His name was François Marchand, and I met him 6 weeks after my arrival, at an open gallery evening in Marais that Dara had encouraged me to attend via a very persistent series of messages that I eventually capitulated to because she knew me well enough to know I would not leave the apartment unless given a specific reason and a specific address. He was standing in front of a large abstract piece, deep blues and umber and a streak of pale gold, when I saw him first. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the way of a man who uses his body actively, with dark blonde hair that curled slightly at his temples and a jaw that was sharp and earnest all at once. He was perhaps 28, 29, with the particular quality of stillness that I associated with people who think carefully before they speak. He was wearing a simple dark jacket and holding a glass of white wine he was not drinking, too absorbed in what he was looking at to remember it existed. I recognized that absorption. I felt it myself whenever I stood in front of something that moved me. I stood beside him at a respectful distance and looked at the same painting. "The gold is wrong," I said before I could decide whether to say anything at all. "The artist mixed too much into the final layer. It's losing its depth. You can see where it wanted to glow and doesn't quite manage it." He turned to look at me, and his eyes were a very particular shade of gray-blue, the color of the Seine on an overcast morning, and his expression was not offended but genuinely, warmly curious. "You paint?" he said. "Not a question." "I do," I said. "François," he said and extended his free hand. "Colin," I said and took it. He was, I learned over the following weeks, a photographer and a conservator, a man who spent his professional hours restoring paintings to their original states, reversing damage, removing centuries of grime from works that had been forgotten and then rediscovered. He had a studio in the 10th arrondissement that smelled perpetually of mineral spirits and old canvas, and he talked about art the way my mother talked to her plants, with a tenderness that was entirely without self-consciousness. He was also, I realized, looking at me. Not in the way Marco had looked at me, that measuring, calculating look I now recognized for what it had been. Francois looked at me the way I looked at a painting that surprised me. Like I was something worth spending time with. Like there was more of me to discover, and he was in no hurry but was not going anywhere either. He asked me to dinner 3 weeks after the gallery. A small place near Canal Saint-Martin, warm and low-lit, with very good wine and food that tasted like someone had made it with genuine attention. "You're careful," he said partway through the evening, in the direct and undefensive way I was learning was simply how he communicated. Not cold, but careful. Like someone who's been hurt and is watching where they put their feet now. I turned my glass in my hands. "Is it that visible?" "Only because I'm paying attention," he said. "I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable. I notice things. Occupational habit." He smiled, and it was slow and warm and reached his gray-blue eyes all the way. "You don't have to explain anything. I'm just glad you came." I looked at him across the table and felt something in me, something that had been clenched and still since that Tuesday in February when I had stood in Marco's hallway and heard the truth. I felt it shift. Not open, not yet. But loosened slightly. Like a knot beginning to consider. "I'm glad I came too," I said. "It happened gradually and then entirely. That is the only way I know how to describe it." Francois was patient in the way of someone who genuinely had no ulterior motive, patient without calculation, without agenda, without the specific tension of someone waiting for the right moment to take something. He was simply present. Consistently, warmly, entirely present. He came to my studio one afternoon. I had begun renting a small space in the 11th, with north-facing windows that threw the best light, and he stood in the middle of the room and looked at what I was working on, and said nothing for a very long time. It was a piece I was still finding my way through. Large, complicated. Reds and deep grays and a narrow passage of light at the center that I had not yet figured out how to complete. "What are you looking for?" he asked finally. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "Something that feels true." He nodded slowly. "What does true feel like for you?" I thought about it. Like when you're looking at something and your chest does something involuntary. Like recognition. He turned to look at me then, and the studio light was falling sideways across his face, catching the line of his jaw, the pale curl at his temple, and my chest did something involuntary. I think we both noticed. "Colin," he said very quietly. "I know," I said. He crossed the studio slowly with that careful, attentive quality that was entirely his own, and when he reached me he raised one hand and tucked a strand of my hair back from my face. A gesture so small and so gentle it should not have undone me the way it did, and then he just looked at me. Close. Waiting. "You can say no," he said. "Or wait. Or never. I am not in a hurry." "I'm not saying no," I said. His mouth found mine slowly, unhurried, with a softness that was almost unbearable after months of careful withholding, from myself, from everyone. He kissed me the way he looked at art, with full attention, with his whole self present, like there was nothing else in the world requiring his focus. One hand came up to rest at the curve of my jaw, his thumb tracing a slow line along my cheekbone, and I made a small sound against his mouth that I would have been embarrassed by if I had been paying attention to anything other than him. We stood like that in the studio in the north-facing light for a long time. When we separated, I was breathing carefully, and his eyes had gone dark, and he was looking at me with an expression that I recognized, because I had painted it in different forms my whole life. It was the expression of someone seeing something real. "Dinner tonight?" he said, his voice slightly lower than usual. "Yes," I said. "Dinner tonight." It was 3 months into whatever we had not named it yet because neither of us was in a hurry to put the painting in a frame before it was finished. When Francois said, on a quiet Sunday morning in his apartment with coffee between us and the Paris rain against the windows, "I am in love with you. I wanted you to know. I'm not asking you to be in the same place. I just didn't want to not say it." I looked at him over my coffee cup. He was wearing an old gray sweater and his hair was unstyled and there was a small smear of restoration varnish on his left forearm that he had not noticed, and he was looking at me with those same morning eyes, steady and open and entirely without guile. "I'm in love with you too," I said. "I've been trying to figure out how to say it." His smile broke across his face like light breaking through cloud cover, sudden and entirely transformative, and he reached across the small kitchen table and took my hand, and that was all, and it was enough. and it was the most I had felt in longer than I could remember. The evening that followed was different. Not because anything had changed but because something had been named, and naming things, I have always found, gives them permission to become fully what they are. We were in his bedroom, the lamp throwing warm amber light across the walls, the rain still steady outside, and Francois was kissing me with a thoroughness that made thinking difficult. His hands were in my hair and my fingers were curled in the front of his shirt, and when he drew back to look at me his breath was uneven and his eyes were very dark. "Tell me what you want," he said. "You," I said. Simply. Completely. He laid me back against the pillows and kissed down the line of my jaw, the curve of my throat, the sharp line of my collarbone, his mouth warm and deliberate and unhurried, as though he had decided to learn me the way he learned restored paintings. Methodically, completely, with full and devoted attention. I let out a slow breath and felt the last of the careful tension I had carried for almost a year finally, completely release. "You are so beautiful," he murmured against my skin, and it was not the practiced compliment of someone performing devotion. It was simply an observation, offered the way he offered everything, without agenda, without art, beyond honesty. When he settled over me, the weight of him was warm and real and present, and I pulled him down by the back of his neck and kissed him with everything I had, with every color, every layer, every piece of what I was that I had spent a year being afraid to show. He was generous and careful and fierce all at once. The particular fierceness of someone who loves without restraint and has decided to show you exactly that. His hands moved over me slowly, learning the architecture of me, and when I arched up into him he made a low sound against my throat that sent heat racing down my spine. He took his time. He asked, quietly, at each new threshold, not breaking the moment but deepening it, turning consent into a kind of tenderness that I had not understood was possible, that made the whole of it feel not just physically overwhelming but emotionally complete. When he finally pressed into me, slowly watching my face the entire time, one large hand warm against my hip, I gasped and his jaw tightened and he held still, forehead dropping briefly to mine. "Okay," he breathed. "Very okay," I managed. The movement that followed was slow and deep and entirely consuming. His length filled me in a way that left no room for thought, only sensation. The heat of him, the closeness, the sound of his breathing growing heavier, the way he said my name in a low, undone voice against my ear like it was something he had been wanting to say for a long time and was finally allowed to. My hands found the planes of his back and held on, and the rhythm between us built gradually like a composition finding its crescendo, until I was shaking apart beneath him with his name in my mouth and his hands holding me through it like I was something worth keeping. He followed not long after, with his face pressed into the curve of my neck and his hands tight in my hair and a sound that I felt more than heard. We lay tangled afterward, his arm around me, my head on his chest, listening to the rain. "I told you," he said eventually into my hair. "Told me what?" "That I was in no hurry. But that I was not going anywhere." I smiled against his chest. "You did tell me that." "I meant it." "I know," I said. "That's the thing about you, Francois. You always mean what you say." He pressed a kiss to the top of my head. "Get used to it." A year later I had a show. My first official gallery show, Galerie Besson in the 3rd arrondissement, a small but highly regarded space that had shown the work of several artists I had admired since I was a student. Dara had made the introduction. The gallerist, a small sharp-eyed woman named Sylvie, had spent 40 minutes with my portfolio and then offered me a show date with the brisk efficiency of someone who did not do things she was not certain about. My parents came. My father stood in front of each piece for a long time with his arms crossed and his expression thoughtful, and when he had seen all 15 he turned to me and said, "You painted better than ever." My mother cried, but the good kind, the kind that means full rather than empty. Francois was there, standing slightly to the side with a glass of wine, watching not my work but me, watching my face as people stopped in front of each painting, watching the way I talked to strangers about what I had made. When our eyes met across the room he raised his glass slightly, and his smile was quiet and private and entirely mine. There was a piece at the center of the show that Sylvie had insisted go on the main wall. It was large, the largest I had made in years. Deep reds and grays, that narrow passage of pale light at the center that I had finally figured out how to complete. It was called Reconnaissance, Recognition. I had painted it in the weeks after I understood that what I felt for Francois was not a relic of habit or loneliness but something new and real and entirely its own. It sold on the opening night before the show had been open an hour. Sylvie told me with visible satisfaction. I nodded, pleased, and went to find Francois. He was standing near the door, and when he saw my face he raised his eyebrows in a question. "Reconnaissance sold," I said. "Congratulations." His smile was warm. To an anonymous buyer, Sylvie added, appearing at my elbow with her characteristically impeccable timing. She looked at Francois. She looked at me. Her expression did not change. Quite anonymous. I looked at Francois. He looked at a point somewhere above my left shoulder with an expression of studied neutrality that was entirely unconvincing on a man as honest as he was. Francois, I said. Yes, he said at the ceiling. Did you buy my painting? I may, he said carefully, have purchased a piece that I find extraordinarily meaningful and that I wish to ensure remains somewhere it would be properly appreciated. I stared at him. My chest was doing that involuntary thing again. You bought the centerpiece of my first gallery show, I said. I would have bought all of them, he said, finally looking at me, but Sylvie very sensibly told me that would be counterproductive to your career. He paused. She is correct. I defer to her judgment in these matters. Sylvie, beside me, made a sound that might have been a laugh very efficiently suppressed. I crossed the distance between us and put my hands on either side of his face and kissed him, properly, in front of my parents and Sylvie and the assembled guests of my first Paris gallery opening, and he kissed me back without hesitation or self-consciousness because that was simply who he was. When I drew back, my father was looking away with a small smile. My mother was not looking away at all and had both hands pressed over her heart. You are ridiculous, I told Francois. I am in love with you, he said simply. They are sometimes the same thing. I know now that love is not the most vivid color in the universe. I was wrong about that. Love is the quality of light that makes colors visible. It is the thing that allows everything else to be seen for what it truly is. Marco taught me that the absence of real love makes everything look like what it is not. It took me too long to understand that, and the lesson was costly, and I do not recommend it. But I do not regret knowing it. I needed to understand what the absence of light looks like in order to recognize the real thing when it finally arrived. I paint differently now. Not better or worse, differently. There is less desperation in it. Less of that quality I used to have of reaching for something just out of frame. I paint, now, from a place that feels like standing still in good light and looking clearly at what is actually in front of me. What is in front of me is this: a studio in Paris with north-facing windows. A man who loves me without conditions or agendas, who buys my paintings not because they are valuable but because he finds them meaningful, who holds me in the dark after difficult days and says very little and means all of it. A mother who calls every Sunday and talks to her new Parisian plants with the same affection she showed her Manchester ones. A father who is quietly, undemonstratively proud in the particular way of a man who builds things to last and has raised a son who he believes will do the same. And me, Colin Rogers, 25 years old, green-eyed, paint-stained, brilliant and hard-working and entirely, improbably, genuinely loved. I pick up my brush. I begin. There is a particular quality to Paris at midnight in the summer. The city does not go quiet, it never fully goes quiet, but it softens. The hard edges of the day round themselves off. The light changes, becomes something amber and slow and private, the kind of light that feels like it belongs only to whoever happens to be standing inside it. The kind of light that makes everything feel like a painting still in progress. That is exactly what it felt like the night I am thinking of now. It was the evening after my gallery opening. We had stayed until the last guest left, until Sylvie had kissed both my cheeks and told me, with her customary efficient warmth, that she expected me to have new work ready within 6 months. My parents had taken a car back to their apartment on the left bank, my mother still dabbing her eyes and my father's hand at the small of her back. Dara had hugged me so hard I felt it in my teeth and then disappeared into the Paris night with the particular energy of someone with excellent plans. And then it was just Francois and me standing on the pavement outside the gallery, the summer air warm against our skin, the street lamp throwing gold across the cobblestones. He looked at me. I looked at him. Come home with me, he said. It was not the first time I had gone home with him. We had been together for months by then, months of slow mornings and shared dinners and the particular intimacy of two people who have decided to be fully known by each other. But something about that night felt different. Heavier with meaning. Brighter. The way a color looks when you apply the final layer and the whole painting shifts into what it was always trying to be. Yes, I said. His apartment was warm and still when we arrived. He had left a lamp on in the corner of the bedroom, the small ceramic one I had pointed out in a shop window 3 weeks into knowing him and that he had returned to by the following day without mentioning it. It threw that amber, intimate light across the walls and the white of the bed linen and the planes of his face when he turned to look at me after setting his keys down. I was still in my gallery clothes, dark trousers, a white shirt I had left open at the collar, my hair slightly disordered from the evening. He looked at me the way he always looked at me in the moments before anything happened between us, like he was making a decision to pay full attention and then paying it. "You were extraordinary tonight," he said. His voice was low and even, but there was an undercurrent to it that I felt in my sternum. "You bought my painting," I said. I was still slightly overwhelmed by this. I thought I might be overwhelmed by it for some time. He crossed the room toward me slowly, and the lamplight moved across his jaw, the line of his shoulder, the dark blonde curl at his temple. He stopped close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I told you," he said. "I find it extraordinarily meaningful." "You find me extraordinarily meaningful," I said. "Yes," he said without any hesitation at all. "I do." He reached up and tucked a strand of hair from my face. That gesture, that specific gesture, that had undone me the first time he used it in my studio and had not stopped undoing me since. And then his hand stayed curved warm against my jaw, his thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone like I was a surface he was learning to restore. I turned my face slightly into his hand. "Francois," I said. "Colin," he said back in a voice that sounded like my name meant something to him. Like it was not simply a label but a word with weight and specific meaning, a word he was glad to know. I kissed him. Or he kissed me. I have never been entirely certain who moves first with us, and I think that is the point. His mouth was warm and unhurried, and he kissed me the way he always kissed me, like the destination was not the point, like the act itself was where he intended to remain for as long as possible. One hand stayed curved at my jaw and the other found the small of my back, drawing me incrementally closer, and I went willingly, my hands rising to his chest, feeling the steadiness of him beneath my palms. The kiss deepened slowly. His lips parted and mine followed, and I made a soft sound against his mouth that I was past being self-conscious about because I had learned, over these months, that the sounds I made affected him in ways I had come to find deeply satisfying. I felt his breath change, felt the slight hitch of it, felt his hand at my back press slightly firmer. "I love you," I said against his mouth. Barely a breath. I said it often now. I said it easily, without the old terror I used to carry around loving people. I said it because it was true and simple and because Francois had taught me, by his own consistent and unhurried example, that love offered honestly is not a vulnerability. It is a gift. "I love you," he said back and drew back only far enough to look at me. His eyes in the lamplight were that deep gray blue that I had tried to mix on a palette 3 separate times and had never quite achieved. There was something in them that made my chest ache in the very best way, that particular fierceness I had noticed early on, the one that sat quietly beneath his calm until moments like this one, when it rose to the surface and made his gaze into something that felt like being fully, completely seen. He reached for the top button of my shirt. He undid it slowly, watching my face rather than his hands, and I stood very still and let him, my breathing deliberate and already not entirely steady. The second button. The third. He parted the shirt open and ran one large warm hand flat against my sternum, feeling the rise and fall of my chest, and I covered his hand with mine briefly before he leaned down and pressed his mouth to my collarbone. I exhaled. He kissed down the center of my chest, unhurried, thorough, his lips warm and his jaw slightly rough, and I tipped my head back and looked at the ceiling and felt my knees doing something imprecise. "Bed," I managed. I felt him smile against my skin. "In a moment," he said and kissed lower. We made it to the bed eventually. The lamp threw its amber warmth across us as he laid me back against the white linen, and he settled over me with that weight I had become deeply fond of, solid and real and warm, present in a way that still sometimes moved me almost to tears because I had spent long enough without the real thing to know precisely how rare it was. He kissed me again, longer this time, deeper, one forearm braced beside my head and the other hand moving over me slowly, my ribs, the curve of my hip, the line of my thigh, relearning me with the same deliberate attention he gave everything. I ran my hands up the plane of his back, feeling the shift of muscle beneath his shirt, and then I pulled at it impatiently and he leaned back on his knees with an expression of mild amusement and pulled it off over his head in a single motion. I pressed my palm flat to his chest. His heart was beating harder than his exterior calmness suggested, and something about knowing that this affected him as much as it affected me, knowing that beneath his steadiness was the same warmth and want, made me pull him back down against me. "Colin," he said very low against my ear. "I know," I said. He kissed the hinge of my jaw, the curve of my ear, the sensitive skin just below it, and I turned my face away reflexively and then back, giving him access, and he made use of it with a thoroughness that left me gripping the bed linen. He moved down my body incrementally, mouth and hands working together, removing what remained of my clothes with patience I was increasingly unable to share, though I knew better by now than to rush him because his patience always, without exception, paid extraordinary dividends. When he finally settled between my thighs and looked up at me, his gray-blue eyes were very dark, his hair slightly disordered, his expression one of focused and complete intent. "Tell me what you want," he said, as he always did. The question that was not a performance but a genuine inquiry, a man who considered knowing what I wanted to be as important as anything else. "I want you," I said. "All of you. Please." The please made something move across his face, something warm and fierce and deeply private, and he pressed a kiss to the inside of my knee and began to work his way up. I will try to describe it with some accuracy because it deserves accuracy. He prepared me carefully and attentively, with a focus that made the room feel very small and very warm, until I was undone against the pillows and making sounds I had long since stopped trying to contain. His hands were steady and his attention was total, and he watched my face the way he watched paintings he was restoring, looking for the true thing beneath whatever had accumulated on top of it, stripping everything back until what remained was entirely real. What remained was this: me entirely open, my chest heaving, my hands in his hair, his name on my lips with a frequency that might have embarrassed me in another life. "Francois," I said, and my voice had gone rough. "Now, please. I need." "I know," he said, and kissed my inner thigh once more deliberately before rising over me. He positioned himself and I felt the blunt heat of him, the weight of his length against me, thick and heavy and insistent, and I exhaled slowly to ease him and watched his jaw tighten with the effort of his control. He pressed in slowly. The stretch of him opening me was extraordinary, that familiar, overwhelming fullness that made my breath leave me in a slow, unsteady rush. He was generous in his length, substantial enough that the first moments always required that careful, deliberate adjustment, and he gave me every second of it, watching my face, forehead dropping to mine as he pressed deeper. "Okay," he breathed. "So okay," I breathed back. "Don't stop." He didn't stop. By the time he was fully seated inside me, I had one hand fisted in the pillow beside my head and the other gripping his shoulder, and my entire body had reorganized itself around the sensation of being completely, thoroughly filled by him. He held still for a moment, for my sake, though the stillness cost him something. I could feel it in the tension of his arms, the controlled steadiness of his breathing. Then he began to move. The rhythm he set was slow and deep, devastating in its deliberateness. Each withdrawal and return measured and precise, his length dragging against every sensitive internal point with an accuracy that made thinking functionally impossible. I could do nothing but hold on and breathe and feel the thickness of him moving inside me, feel the warm weight of his body against mine, feel his mouth at my throat saying things in low, rough French that I caught only in fragments but understood entirely from the tone. "Tu es magnifique. You are magnificent. Je t'aime. I love you, Colin." My name, in his voice, reduced to 2 syllables that sounded like everything. I pulled him down by the back of his neck and kissed him, open-mouthed and desperate, and he answered by driving deeper, and I gasped against his lips and he swallowed the sound and kept moving. The rhythm built. Inevitably, beautifully, the way a composition builds, slowly at first, one layer at a time, and then gathering momentum until the whole thing is moving and there is nothing to do but let it arrive. I felt myself climbing toward it with a focus that narrowed my entire world to the heat and pressure and fullness of him, to the sound of his breathing growing rougher against my ear, to the way he said my name in a voice gone entirely undone. "Francois," I started. "I know," he said low and rough and right at my ear, and shifted his angle fractionally, and I lost my entire mind. The release came through me like color blooming on a wet canvas, sudden and spreading and impossible to control, overwhelming in its vividness, my back arching, his name leaving me in a sound that was not quite a word, his length buried deep inside me as I came apart around him, my hands gripping him hard enough to leave marks I would feel fondly in the morning. He followed seconds later with a low, rough sound pressed into the curve of my neck and his hands tight at my hips, pulling me flush against him as he spent himself inside me, his whole body shuddering with the force of it. We lay still for a long, complete moment. His weight on me was warm and real and present. My hands moved slowly over the planes of his back, up and down, feeling him breathe. Later, much later, he rolled to his side and gathered me against him in that particular way he had, his arm around my waist, my back to his chest, his mouth pressed to the nape of my neck. The lamp was still on in the corner. The Paris summer night was warm and still around us. Somewhere distantly, the city continued its soft nocturnal murmur, indifferent and beautiful. "Colin," he said. "Very quiet." I said. Pause. His thumb traced a slow circle against my hip. "The painting," he said. "The one I bought tonight." I smiled in the dark. Yes. I want to put it in the studio, he said. Across from the window. In the morning light. I turned my head slightly on the pillow to look at him over my shoulder. He was watching me with those gray-blue eyes, soft now, heavy with the hour and the warmth between us. You want my painting in your studio, I said. I want, he said carefully, to look at something true while I work. And that piece, he paused. That piece is the truest thing I have ever seen you make. I looked at him for a long moment. I made it about you, I said. About what it felt like to realize what I felt for you was real. I know, he said quietly. I could see it. That is why I needed to have it. I turned fully toward him, facing him now, and pressed my forehead to his. He closed his eyes. I did too. Francois, I said. Oui, he said. I love you. Je t'aime, he said. And then in English, because he knew I liked hearing it both ways, I love you. Completely. Without condition. Without end. The lamp threw its amber warmth across the white bed linen, across the planes of his face, across the particular irreplaceable geography of this life I had found on the other side of devastation. I thought about Marco briefly, not with bitterness, not anymore, but with the quiet, almost academic acknowledgement of someone who has learned an expensive lesson and retained it. Without what happened, I would not be here. Without the breaking, I would not have found my way to Paris, to this studio, to this life, to this man who loved me with his whole, honest, unhurried self. I thought about the paintings. The ones I had given away as love and had been sold as currency. They were gone, most of them, dispersed in legal limbo, some returned to me through the court process and now in storage until I decided what to do with them. They were part of the record of something I had survived. And I thought about Reconnaissance, hanging tomorrow in Francois' studio in the morning light, being looked at by a man who understood what he was seeing. I was not my paintings, but the best parts of me were in them. And the best painting I had ever made was going to spend its life being truly, genuinely seen. I thought this was enough. More than enough. More than I had known to hope for back when hope felt dangerous. I pressed closer to Francois. He wrapped his arm tighter around me. I closed my eyes. I slept, in Paris, in the amber light, deeply and without dreaming, and in the morning when I woke, the first thing I saw was his gray-blue eyes open and watching me, warm and patient and entirely present, exactly as he had promised he would be. I reached up and touched his face. He turned his mouth into my palm and kissed it once. Good morning, he said. Good morning, I said. And it was